continue right here with the Laura Lee Show, looking at yet another ancient mystery. And you know we've been researching with every new piece of data that is added to our puzzle, various ancient cultures, their relationship to one another, this shared language, how they were so great at navigation and understanding the world in which they lived and our world's relationship to the solar system at large, their sophisticated astronomy, and this symbolic language that was cross-cultural through times, and we've looked at diffusionism and this trade among cultures, etc., etc. And we've got one more very key piece to add to this puzzle, and that comes from Alan Butler. He's a British researcher, and he will decode what he calls a Bronze Age computer disk. He's here with the story. Hi, Alan. Glad to have you back.
Nice to be with you again.
Alan, by the way, was the one with his research partner decided that the Templars had started the country of Switzerland. We heard about that some weeks ago. But this Bronze Age computer disk, tell us the story of how you happened on this. I understand in your book, Bronze Age Computer Disk, it was on a holiday to Greece. Tell us the story.
Well, it started about 10 years ago, Laura. I decided to take a break. I've been a professional writer for quite some time now, and like everybody, I needed a bit of a break, and I decided to go on a trip to Crete, which, for anybody who doesn't know, is a beautiful island in the eastern Mediterranean. And off I went on the trip, and I loved the place from the moment I got there. It's like a Garden of Eden. And I was walking around in the local town, which was called Malia, and in a shop window I saw a lot of facsimiles of a little clay disc, which they call the Phaistos Disc, because it was found in a place called Phaistos.
And it's Phaistos.
That's it, yes, and it's in the south of the island. But the disc is to be found everywhere throughout Crete because it's so famous. Although, strangely enough, here in England and across in America, it's not really all that well known. It was found in the ruins of an ancient palace called Phaistos, and it was found at the beginning of this century. I was fascinated immediately. I saw the disc because it's a very unique sort of artifact. There isn't anything else like it in the world. It's about 5.5 inches in diameter, and on each side it's covered with hieroglyphic symbols in certain groupings and within spirals. But no doubt we'll talk about that a bit more as time goes on. But what fascinated me, first of all, was just the thing itself, just the look of the thing, and I've always been a real sucker for anything that's a bit strange or mysterious.
Would you describe the Phaistos Disc for us?
Yes, exactly.
And we have a picture of it and you up on our screen here on our website, but go ahead.
Okay, right. Well, the disc is kind of brick red in colour because it's made of baked clay. It's circular, and on each side it has an incised spiral. And within the spiral there are groups which are where the spiral has been divided across the worlds of the spiral, and within these groups are groups of hieroglyphics, and they look not dissimilar to Egyptian hieroglyphics. There are pictures of little people and pictures of ears of wheat and pictures of beehives and fish, all sorts of different kinds of pictures, all in different kinds of groupings. And when I first saw the disc, I thought it was one-sided. I didn't realize it had two sides to it. But it has two sides, and on one side it has 30 groups of hieroglyphics, and on the other side it has 31.
Yeah, by groups you mean that along the spiral they have divisions.
That's right, yes, and within the divisions are groups. Sometimes there's maybe 3 hieroglyphics within a group, sometimes 4, sometimes 5, even as much as 7. But it differs on each occasion, and the hieroglyphics work out from the centre, as it were, forming this pattern of 30 groups on one side and 31 on the other. And to be quite honest, at first I had no idea at all what this might mean, but I managed to obtain a very large picture of the disc, which I took back to the hotel with me, and I sat round the pool like one does on holiday, and I mused about this particular artifact. And I happened to talk to the guy who ran the hotel. Now, everybody in Crete is absolutely fascinated with anybody who's interested in Cretan history. And when I got up for breakfast the next morning, on the breakfast table, there was a facsimile of the disc. And I'm actually looking at that facsimile now. And it was the guy who owned the hotel who'd got it for me before breakfast. But believe me, if you ever go to Crete, you'll find out that people there are like that. And that's when I realised that the disc had two sides to it. Well, this was the second day into my holiday, and I have to tell you, Laura, it was the end of my holiday, really, in effect, because I just spent the rest of the time I was there trying to find out just as much as I could about the disc and what it might have to say.
Ever the researcher, huh?
Absolutely. I mean, my wife will tell you, that I can't go anywhere without looking at something.
Was she a bit miffed, or was she saying, oh, there he goes again?
Oh, no, she's very happy, fortunately. I'm the luckiest man in the world in that respect. But I think that she knew when we first met that this was the kind of man I am, and I'm not likely to change now.
That's the key to marriage. Never try to change your partner.
Absolutely.
Yep. So what happened then? You pondered over this thing. What kind of avenues did you first take to try to decode this?
Well, I went into the main city of Crete, which is called Heraklion, and I went to the bookshops, and I got as many English translations as I could of books that might mention something about the Phaistos Disc. And in fact, there wasn't really all that much. But I was coming up with the same story time and time again, that all sorts of people had lots of different ideas about what the disc might be, but that nobody had managed to interpret what the hieroglyphics might mean. First of all, it's important to stress that we do know that the disc goes back to a civilization that was living on Crete round about 2000 to 1700 BC, and it was Europe's first super civilization. They were called the Minoans, at least that's the name that we've given to them. We have no idea what these people called themselves, but that's the era that they lived in during the European Bronze Age, roughly contemporary with the time when the New Kingdom was being formed in Egypt, so that gives you a kind of a time reference.
And these, of course, were the very interesting costumes where the women's breasts were just there for all to see.
Oh, they were an incredible culture, Laura. I mean,
these are the ones that flipped over the bowls, these interesting acrobatics with live bowls.
Absolutely, yes. They were really incredible people. We know a great deal more about them than we do about other Bronze Age cultures apart from Egypt, because they left a great many artifacts. For example, they were superb potters, they were great metalsmiths, they were wonderful farmers. Just as an example of their farming acumen, one particular palace, Knossos, which is one of the more famous of the palaces, was running at the time at least 50 to 60,000 sheep. So you can tell that we're not talking about a civilization here which was in any way retarded or held back. In fact, they
had their entrepreneurs,
extremely advanced. They had great entrepreneurial skills. They were mixing with all the other peoples in the region.
Now, here's the real hallmark, Alan, of how sophisticated they were. They had indoor plumbing. Would you like to describe their indoor plumbing?
Yes. The biggest palace of the four major palaces which have been found, or the ruins thereof, we can see from the ruins that are left to us that they not only were able to supply themselves with incoming water, but they were able to deal with sewage as well. And in one of the apartments in this palace, which is known as the royal apartment or the Queen's apartment, there is the world's first flushing toilet. I've seen it. It's absolutely incredible.
How did they flush the toilet?
We're talking about 2000 BC.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, there were many people in this country who didn't have flushing toilets 20 years ago, so 2000 BC is...
Well, what did they rig up to flush a toilet? Tell us.
They had a stone cistern which was fed by a stream, and there was an alternative route for the water to take once the cistern was full. But if you went to the toilet there, you simply pressed the handle as you would in a normal toilet, and down came the water.
Fascinating. I saw something similar in one of the Mayan temples. I think this was at Palenque, and they had, a toilet seat carved out. It was obviously that's what it was, and it was over a running stream.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is even more
sophisticated than that,
because it has a cistern as well. But the amazing thing about the toilet seat in the Cretan example is that you may go to a DIY store now or to any kind of store and buy an almost identical toilet seat. Incredible.
It's a hallmark of sophistication and civilization, I would think.
Well, I think it has a great deal to do with what we would call civilization, because it's the kind of detail that you don't really have time to think about until things are going pretty well for you.
Oh, I see. You've got to have the food, the shelter, the...
I think so. I think you've got to be fairly sophisticated before you start worrying about teak toilet seats.
There you go. What else is interesting about the Minoans, as you put up in your very interesting website, we have a link to it, and you talk about in your book, is that they really weren't all that warfaring. They had a navy where they kept pirates away from their end of the Mediterranean, but it didn't look like they really had to defend themselves too much.
No, there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever of any kind of large standing army. And most of the goods that were made during the island, in the island, particularly agricultural goods, for example, seem to have been brought ultimately to these huge palaces. But there is no indication that the palaces were fortified in any way. Now, fortifications are useful for two reasons, I guess. One, to stop outsiders coming in, but the other reason is that you've got to fortify them against the local populace if you think you're going to ever have any kind of civil insurrection. There is no evidence of this whatsoever. They seem to have been a very peaceful society. Of course, they had a fortress of a kind because they were living on an island in the middle of the Mediterranean, and there really wasn't a civilization around at the time that could have mounted a naval blockade of the island. But still, within the people themselves, they seem to have been very peaceful. There isn't a single example until much later Greek times of anyone bearing arms, of anyone wearing armour, and we're talking about a pretty bad time in Europe. Everybody else was fighting tooth and nail, but certainly not on Crete.
How interesting. They were very artistic. They built beautiful houses that were very comfortable. They used natural lighting, put wells in the house, light wells.
Oh, absolutely. And also, Laura, which is of great interest in terms of our own present society, there was a very equitable balance between male and females. There don't seem to have been any gender stresses there at all. In fact, we know from much later periods that women on Crete were still able to dispose of their own land in the way that they wanted. They could marry whom they wanted. They could marry again if they wanted, if they were widowed or divorced. So it was a very equitable society.
And reflecting in that is, in their religion, they had a central goddess who remained the same, but it was the guy that revolved around her. Do you want to explain that one?
Yes, I do. I think this is probably the most fascinating part about the Minoans, and it may well serve to explain why the sexual balance within society was so good. Their prime deity seems to have been a goddess who was perpetual. She was associated with the earth. I mean, we could talk all day just about this subject, but very briefly, she would marry the sky god, who would then be known as the old god, and he would get together with the goddess, and they would have a child who would become the young god, and at that time the old god would die. The young god would grow to manhood, and he would become the consort of the queen. She would have another child who would be the young god again, and then the old god would die. So it was a perpetual thing, and that's one of the clues I got about the disc probably being astrological or astronomical, because cycles and passages of time seem to have been absolutely important to the Minoans all the way through.
Let's talk more about that after this break, but it's interesting that, again, you have this trinity, the mom, the dad, the kid, right? And the kid becomes and you do it all over again. But it's interesting, you see that hallmark of that trinity, that family unit, in so many other major religions. We come back with Alan Butler. He's the author of the Bronze Age Computer Disc. You can get your copy at 800-243-1438. Comes with a free tape of this interview. You can also find his website. We have a link to it on our own at www.lauralee.com. I'm Laura Lee. We continue right here on the Laura Lee Show as Alan Butler, author of the Bronze Age Computer Disc, tells us how he decoded this artifact. Again, baked clay circles only 5 inches in diameter. This must have been the pocket version of this one, Alan. Otherwise, it's a little hard to read those hieroglyphs. It should have been bigger. I imagine they have a lot of different, bigger versions. But as he continues to tell us how he, on a vacation to Crete, this was a Minoan artifact, and they're quite well known there. and hopefully with your work will be known to the world as a very important piece and a clue to understanding the Minoans and their relationship to the rest of the various ancient cultures and astronomy, etc. We'll get to all that. But here's a comment from the chat room I want to share with you from Uki. He says, interestingly, the spiral-like arrangement of the symbols does resemble how data is arranged on modern computer discs like CDs. Interesting. He's had the benefit of seeing the Phaistos Disc because we have it up on our screen for our chat room. If you'd like to log on as well and follow along, see those images, go to www.lauralee.com and follow the instructions there. You can also find your way to Alan Butlers' very interesting webpage as well. You know, that spiral-like arrangement, and I would ask everyone to go grab the pen and paper because Alan likely will ask you to draw a few simple drawings to help you understand the composition of this disc. But you draw a circle and then you draw a spiral within the circle. And the other place I saw this was in Dendera, the famous zodiac on the ceiling of one of the rooms there is in a spiral. I'd never really seen the zodiac in a spiral, but it's a very compact way to arrange the data on a circle. This is similar to the Phaistos Disc, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. The spiral is quite sensible in a way, because if you were to sit in the sunshine with a magnifying glass and direct it onto, for example, a piece of wood and follow the course of the sun throughout the day, it would actually etch a spiral onto the piece of wood. So I think our ancient ancestors probably saw the movement of the sun around the sky not so much as a circle but as a spiral. So it makes quite a deal of sense, and that's the clue that gave me the idea we might be looking at some kind of calendar here.
Oh, that's a wonderful clue. And the sun would scribe that spiral. I've seen people do that experiments because of the tilt of the Earth.
That's right, yes. The way the interrelationship between the Earth and the Sun makes that possible, and it certainly seems to have been known back in the Bronze Age in other parts of Europe, because we've found so many examples of spirals.
What's interesting here is that as you decode this, you begin to understand how much they must have known about basic astronomy.
Oh, I was flabbergasted, Laura. Absolutely flabbergasted. But, of course, it unfolded piece by piece, like all good puzzles do. Well, you can't solve a crossword puzzle instantly. It takes time.
Well, tell us the story chronologically, how each piece, each clue came into the forefront for you.
Okay, well, first of all, as far as the hieroglyphics themselves are concerned, these beautiful little symbols, they appear to be closely related to Egyptian ones, but they're not the same. They don't mean the same. And the biggest problem with the Phaistos Disc is not being able to understand what language was being spoken on Crete at the time. And, of course, that's the first requisite to interpreting anything. And so, although I read many examples of what the disc might mean, there is no one single representation which is taken as being the real one. And so I kept looking at the disc, and then I thought to myself, let's have a look at the numbers involved here, because maybe if I can't read the disc, maybe it has some mathematical relationship which is important too. And maybe if I could understand that, it might lead us eventually to understanding what the disc says. So I looked very carefully, and I discovered that on the side of the disc that I call side A, now for the sake of the people who may be looking at the disc at the moment on the computer screen, side A is the one that has a rosette or a flower in the center of it, whereas side B is the one that starts in the center with a sort of a triangle. So looking at side A for the moment, on that side of the disc, there are 31 groups, and within those groups, there are 123 symbols, and on side B, there are 30 groups, and there are 119 symbols. Now, because I had dealt with numbers for most of my working life, because I'm something of an expert on calendars, I immediately realized that there may be a mathematical significance here. Now, this part of the explanation appears to be fairly complicated when I tell you now, but in the book it's explained very slowly, step by step, so it's not a big mathematical deal. But then what happened, Laura, was I came to a crashing insight, an immediate insight, and that's how ideas often come across. Because I realized that if you were to multiply the number of...
We have to take a break, Alan. We have a cliffhanger here.
Okay.
You came to a crashing insight. You're going to have to wait a few minutes after these messages to find out what that was, as we hear the story chronologically of the clues that came into place to help Alan Butler decode what's known as the Phaistos Disc. He calls it a Bronze Age computer disc. more with Alan Butler right here on The Laura Lee Show. I'm Laura Lee. We continue right here on The Laura Lee Show with our guest, Alan Butler, author of The Bronze Age Computer Disc. I love detective stories, especially the real-life, ancient mystery sort. With one in the chat room saying probably the most obvious way to record continuous information is on a round object. And Pooch is asking, so what does the disc have to tell us? That's what Alan is sharing with us, as he spent quite a bit of time decoding this through some real ingenious insights. And you're about to tell us one of the most, as you put it, crashing insights that you had. What was that, Alan?
Well, what happened, Laura, was I suddenly looked at the disc. This was one morning, sitting by the swimming pool in beautiful Crete, and it suddenly occurred to me exactly what it was. I mean, the idea came full-blooded into my mind, and I'll explain how I came by this. But I must tell you that for some years I had been looking for a lost calendar of ancient peoples. I knew that even today we measure time in minutes and seconds, and also even today we measure degrees of arc also in minutes and seconds, but the two things don't relate to each other at all, which effectively they should do if we're going to use the same terminology for both. So we need to hold that fact in our mind. And that had led me to believe that there must once have been a kind of calendar which allowed for time and for degrees of arc to be measured in the same way. And I had reasoned for many years that this calendar would have to be based on a ritual number of days in the year, which would be 366 days. And again, we'll explain that as we go on.
Well, also the concept of a light year, you know, how much distance can light travel in a year, is relating time and space together.
Absolutely,
as a unit.
Yeah,
and
but of course this concept was way beyond my immediate comprehension. The reason I was looking for the 366-day year was because I knew that this kind of year would be easy for them to relate to the real year. I have to tell you, Laura, that one of the greatest problems that our ancient ancestors had was understanding the true length of the year, because, as you know, the year is 365 and a quarter days long, or thereabouts, not an even number of days, and you have no idea how many problems that created for our ancient ancestors.
Well, let's put that in real terms. The amount of time that it takes Earth to revolve around the sun once, and the number of days when you add them up, and can that be evenly divided into, you know, one day, one circumference of Earth turning on itself, doesn't quite begin and end at the same point, right? That's the problem.
No, absolutely not. I mean, the solar system of which we are part is a wonderful machine, but it doesn't quite work, and this has frustrated people since time immemorial.
Although one of those other odd things is that our moon is about the same size as the sun, even though from our perspective, that's unusual. So something works.
This is one of the real peculiarities of the solar system, because at times of eclipse it covers the sun absolutely beautifully.
Perfectly, yeah.
But maybe it isn't such a coincidence, because I'm beginning to understand that things are ordered in the solar system in such a way as to appear to be incredible. And you can imagine how our ancient ancestors saw this. I mean, the hand of the goddess, in the case of the Minoans, was clearly behind this.
Oh, how interesting. But go ahead. So you're telling us some of the problems that you'd always been musing and wondering about. By the way, what other calendars had you looked at, ancient calendars, and why was there such a fascination for you?
Well, I had looked at, obviously, the Central American calendars, of which there are a great proliferation, particularly from people like the Mayans and the Aztecs. And I knew that they, in order to try and establish the true length of the year, they went about it a different way. They used to measure the orbital periods of lots of the planets and put them all together like a gearbox, if you like, and that would eventually give them the true length of the year. And for anybody who's growing or harvesting crops, this is absolutely essential. But I knew, for example, that the Egyptian calendar was clearly not right. They had 360 days in the year, and they used to add 5 days on, which they called holidays, which I guess was great for the people who wanted holidays. But even so, it wasn't correct. But the Egyptians were the only major civilization around at the time, apart from the Mesopotamian ones, and it wasn't really important for them to know the true length of the year, because They governed their harvesting and planting by the rising of the star Sirius, and they didn't have seasons as such. So 360 plus 5 was ideal for them.
But when you say the calendar didn't work, what you meant was if you continue to add this quarter day or the 5 days or whatever, eventually over many thousands of years it would be completely off. So
oh yes, Laura, it doesn't even take thousands of years, it takes an incredibly short period of time. The Egyptian calendar would have been out with a true calendar within 5 or 6 years, but because they didn't need an accurate calendar, it didn't really matter to them.
It was self-regulating by the rise of Sirius, the star system.
That's it.
Which coincided with when the Nile was flooding.
They knew when they saw what they call the helical rising of Sirius that very soon the Nile would flood, and sometimes it would be a big flood and sometimes it would be a small one, but it would always happen. And that was the way they saw the Godhead, and that was the way they saw their civilization going. But on an island like Crete, the situation is entirely different. They were planting and harvesting crops, and they needed an accurate calendar, as indeed they did nearly all over Europe. And so I had imagined that they would have to have a calendar which would allow them to stay accurately in tune with the sun, and that's what I had been looking for so long.
And this is why we have leap years.
Yes, absolutely.
As a same attempt to correct that same problem.
Yes, we add 1 day every 4 years, and that kept us roughly right, but even that's not accurate enough, and as you said, over a period of hundreds or thousands of years, even that system's going to fall apart, which is why we have these additional rules, like sometimes we add a day in century years, and sometimes we don't, and so forth. So it's very, very complicated, and it works for us, but we have to remember these very complicated rules and regulations. What would be much better would be a year that would allow you to do it automatically.
You know, you've asked me something I've wondered about too, which is the Egyptians were charting the course of Venus, and so were the Mayans and other South American cultures, the Aztecs. This is why they were charting Venus and some of these other planets, was to put these gears, you can imagine large and small gears of a clock, so to speak, and so when they all came together after so many years, then it would help them track their calendar?
Absolutely. Human beings are incredible people, you know, because there always is two reasons historically why people do things. First of all, they do things for a religious purpose, but usually there is a practical purpose underpinning that, and I'm sure that in most cases what these people were trying to do was to build up this gearbox, what became known in the Middle Ages as the harmony of the spheres. Everybody believed that everything fitted so nicely into everything else. But, you know, people like the Mayans were very clever. They knew it wasn't quite that simple.
Right. But in a sense, it does help you track time. I mean, there is an advantage to this.
I think, yes, and I think it's the intellectual abstraction that tells us that they understood that too. So at every level there is a practicality involved. If you can work out exactly what Venus is doing especially, we'll talk about Venus more in due time, but Venus especially helps us to understand the way Earth time happens.
And there's a lot of mystic lore around Venus for some very interesting geometric reasons, but we can talk about that later. So there were two puzzles here, and one was, how do you get a calendar that is self-regulating so it doesn't throw you off after so many years? How do you devise that? And the second one was, you felt that because of the language of minutes and seconds, and even you're going to explain to us why we divide it into 60, after all, or some estimation, approximation of that. The other question was how to track and measure time and distance with the same units of measure. Those were the two objects here, or goals here. So then what happened?
So I discovered that if you were to multiply the number of symbols on one side of the disk by the number of symbols on the other side, you would come up with the number 14637. And that is incredibly close to 14640, which would be 40 years if you assume the year to contain 366 days.
So 365 days, but then you have to fudge around, so why not 366?
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's when the crashing insight came in, because I realized on side A of the disk there were 123 symbols. Now, I don't want to tie up your listeners with mathematics, because although it is a mathematical puzzle, at the end it has a very practical application. What I was looking for here was, I thought almost immediately, a second calendar. very much like the Venus calendar of the Mayans, a calendar which would allow people to be able to rectify the year of 366 days so that it fell exactly in tune with what the sun really does. That's the big historical puzzle, and that's what I soon realized the Phaistos Disc could do.
And you did this not by translating the hieroglyphs, because to this day, you probably don't know, nor does anyone, what those particular set of hieroglyphs mean. You did it by the arrangement of them and the number of them. Clever, yeah. Alan, very clever.
Well, I had a clue. I had a clue, really, Laura, because on side A of the disc, many of the patterns, many of the groups of symbols repeat themselves, but they only repeat themselves in a very specific way. Okay. For example, if group 1 is a certain arrangement of symbols, you may find that again on group 4. Always when symbols repeat themselves, the number of groups between is divisible by 3. So I knew already that there was something deeply mathematical about the disc. It isn't entirely arbitrary. That's what gave me the clue. And then I realized that 123 multiplied by 4 comes to 492. Now, this was the real insight, because I had already realized if you want to make a 366-day calendar work properly, all you have to do is take off one day every 492 days, and then you will have a calendar which remains accurate for over 3,600 years.
Now, how did you know that? How did you figure that one out?
Well, I just played around with numbers. It's our way to take off one day every 4 years. That's one way of going about it, but it's not the most accurate way. If you can keep a second calendar going alongside the first calendar, it will automatically tell you when to remove a day. And of course, a part of a year is just as important as a year. But from an intellectual viewpoint, this seems to be a bit of an abstraction. So we're looking at something which is really quite profound, quite clever. But the reason that I've been able to work it out is because I have a pocket calculator, and these people didn't, of course.
Although I think this was a little pocket calculator. 5
it was in its own
inches.
Way,
yeah, they must have had much bigger ones elsewhere as well, I wonder. I mean, it's not that they had one. They probably had copies of this all over the place that all of their priests and calendar keepers were using, right?
Oh, yes, I think we're just looking at one example, and I'm not even absolutely sure that the example that we have left to us was specifically designed for this job. It merely contains the number principle which allows this job to be done. I think they probably use these replicating number patterns in almost every aspect of religion and civil law. I think it's just very unfortunate that we've only found one disc. Oh, very fortunate, if you like to look at it that way, because it is made of clay, and it is well over 3,000 years old.
Yep. Well, this is interesting, too, because as someone who's familiar with other calendars and who had pondered this whole puzzle for some years prior to coming across the Phaistos Disc, you were able to look at these numbers 1, 4, 6, 3, 7, 40, 492, and not see where other people might say, oh, gematria or sacred numbers, or go to the Bible and see if they're there. You know, people do different things with numbers. I mean, I know some researchers who are numbers obsessed and looking for, you know, how many vibrations, if it contains the note of A, and different things, which may be all well and good for their aspect. There are different ways to look at numbers and try to see through them. You had the language of calendars in front of you, so that was, I mean, you're fortunate that the researchers, the research of the world is fortunate that you happen to come in knowing what you do about calendars and knowing what these numbers meant and when they appeared before you.
I think what also helped me, Laura, was that I had for 20 years been a professional astrologer. So I knew a great deal about astrology, and I knew quite a lot about astronomy as well. And I think you're absolutely right, Laura. We always approach these things from our own particular perspective.
Thank you. That's the point I'm trying to make. Like the guy who went into Baghdad, one of the museums there, and saw that little, what we now know is a clay jar battery. They didn't have a clue, but it took a guy who was familiar with batteries, an engineer, to look at those artifacts and go, oh, obviously you add an electrolyte solution, wine or vinegar or lemon juice, and you've got a battery. Nobody else would have known that if they hadn't known what the pieces could have meant. That was my point. We come back with Alan Butler, author of the Bronze Age Computer Disc, and we'll hear in this real-life detective story how he continued to decode this, what he calls computer disc, how it serves as a computer disc, we'll have to define computer disc there, and what it tells us about the culture that made it, Norley. We continue our detective story with Alan Butler, author of The Bronze Age Computer Disc. You're telling us that your background as an astrologer, your familiarity with calendars, helped you see through these various numbers that were popping up as you played around with the number of symbols on this Phaistos Disc, side A and side B. Go ahead.
What I came to realize eventually, Laura, was that the whole thing revolves around periods of time of 123 days and ritual periods of 40 years, because it's at 40 years that 123 days reaches 14640 days, which is very similar to the number of symbols on the disc if they're multiplied together. This all sounds a bit complicated and abstract, but in the end, if you understand calendars, it starts to give you the option for building a second calendar which allows you to rectify the real solar calendar in order that you can understand exactly when to plant and harvest crops. So there is a very practical application to this. But one of the first puzzles that I had was not understanding why the calendar didn't contain 432 symbols, because that is the operative number that we need in order to be able to regulate the year. So I said to myself, well, why did they use a system of 123 days rather than 492? And the answer came to me after quite a long time of looking, and it was because I realized that what they were trying to do was to get the accuracy of their calendar much more accurate than you would need in order just to plant and harvest crops. If you want to know exactly where the sun is at any particular time within the zodiac, then you have to be able to split it much more accurately than just one day. And using a 123-day cycle would give you the option to split it by 1/4 of a day, which in astronomical terms is also 1/4 of a degree. The heavens around us is a huge circle, and all circles we split historically into degrees, and the degrees we
Those are like pie slices.
That's right, yeah. And we split the degrees into units which we call minutes, and eventually we learned how to split those units even smaller into divisions that we call seconds.
So they were trying to devise a clock with the equivalent of a second hand.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But then I said to myself, okay, so if they wanted to know exactly where the sun was in the zodiac at any point in time to within 1/4 of a degree, they were talking about a degree of accuracy which was far greater than we would credit to any ancient civilization.
Why would they go to all that trouble unless they had a really good purpose?
Absolutely. I mean, just as an example, if you were to hold your arm up towards the sky with your thumb uppermost, your thumbnail would represent about 1 degree of the heavens. So that's a very small amount, but if you imagine that you want to chop that into 60 further units to get to minutes, it's so incredibly small, Laura, that it really isn't worth talking about.
Not in terms of time, but it's significant.
That's right, so they must have had some other reasons for doing it.
Yeah.
And that was when crashing insight number 2 came in, because I suddenly realized that what they were trying to measure with this incredibly accurate system was not the sky, but the earth upon which we live. Because although 1 minute of arc isn't particularly big in the heavens, it's certainly quite big on the earth. And so, if you were to use this whole system and turn the sky inside out, you would have a very accurate way of measuring the Earth.
Isn't that exciting? And you would use the same units of measure and incorporate time and space together in this system. Well, how much is 1 minute of arc on Earth? How many feet or meters or whatever is that?
It's round about a modern mile at the equator. So, I said to myself, okay, well, if they were going to do this, then maybe they split things even more finely, and maybe they had seconds of arc like we do. And I came to realize that instead of having 60 seconds to the minute of arc, they had 6. And I came to that by a process of logical deduction, which I'll explain as time goes on. But that left me with a problem.
Okay.
If they were going to have measured such small units of linear measurement upon the Earth, they would have needed a basic unit of measurement like we have the meter or the foot or the yard. They would have needed something.
And that would have related to this particular measurement, too. This would have been based on Earth's circumference or something.
Absolutely. But where, Laura, was I going to find an existing linear measurement that was upwards of 4,000 years old?
Well, you went and hit the history books and seen who else came up with this, right?
I already knew about a guy called Professor Alexander Thom. He was an amazing guy. He lived he died about 20 years ago, and he had spent most of his life measuring all the megalithic monuments of Britain and France, like Stonehenge and Avebury, and he had come to a conclusion that all of these monuments had been built using the same basic measurement. And that measurement was what he called the megalithic yard. And it's about 82.96 centimeters in length.
What is that in inches?
That's 2.722 feet.
Okay.
So I thought, well, this is ridiculous. There's no way that this can have anything to do with the Minoans, because, of course, we're talking about something that existed in modern Britain and France, not right across the Mediterranean. But just for the sake of the exercise, I applied this megalithic yard to the measurements that I found from the Phaistos Disc, and lo and behold, it fitted absolutely perfectly.
And this is no coincidence, of course.
It cannot be a coincidence. Mainly it can't be a coincidence because I came across later, as I'll mention later, I came across a purely Minoan measurement which meshes completely with a megalithic yard. But what we are left with at this stage in the proceedings is we now know that they thought of the Earth as being split into 366 units, and that each of those was split into 60 further units, and that each of those was split into 6 units further still. And the amazing thing about this is that when you go to the smallest unit, which I call the megalithic second, it measures at the equator exactly 366 megalithic yards. So we're right back to the beginning.
Now, could this be, and you're saying that this was a shared culture, so this used to be the standard of measurement for all of the cultures that were connected. We know they had a similar language of symbol, and astrology was one of the carriers of that language and those symbols, et cetera, but if the Egyptians or the Sumerians who used a 360-degree circle, which nicely divides into 12, so you can use the base 12 for mathematics, and then you get 6 and 10 and all that kind of stuff. If they didn't need something so accurate, is it easier to use 360 than 366? Isn't it easier to divide? So if you don't need the accuracy, then you make it a little simpler. I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's another great perception, because quite obviously, if you do not want to measure the Earth absolutely accurately, if you merely want to keep track of the days, 360 is a much better system, because 360 is so divisible by other things.
Yeah,
but in terms of absolute accuracy, there are so many things it won't do.
Right, so it just depends on, do you want a simpler to use system that isn't going to be as accurate for all the things you need to do, or do you want to go through the extra effort to have a really accurate system? Just a matter of choice. Maybe they had both systems at once, or in different cultures they used for different systems.
In fact, the two systems integrate extremely well. I think what actually happened is that we are looking at a system here, Laura, which is incredibly old, and eventually people dropped the 366 aspect of it because certain things happened in Europe and in Northern Africa, which meant that they would adopt the 360 system and not even realize what they'd lost.
That happens so much. I mean, look at us. Look what we have today. Just remnants of once very intact system. We don't even know where it comes from half the time. So we're living proof of that phenomenon, aren't we? We continue with Alan Butler. His book is the Bronze Age Computer Disc. You can get your copy with a free tape of this interview at 800-243-1438. I'm Norley. We continue this hour with our guest, Alan Butler, author of the Bronze Age Computer Disc. Again, get your copy of this book if you'd like to read all the details of a fascinating ancient mystery detective story as he decoded this disc, found out what it was as he's been describing over the last hour. You can call 800-243-1438 for a copy of the book. It comes with a free tape of this interview. But before we get to the calls, a couple of things. You have a bit more explaining there to do, Alan, and I just want you to respond to a couple of comments from our chat room at www.lauralee.com. Here's a comment. Alan must be using the word computer to get attention for the book. Well, I always thought it was pretty clever because as Earth Watcher also comments in response to that comment, he says, well, a slide rule is a computer, a thermometer is a computer, and indeed an aid or a tool that helps you compute or calculate, you could call a computer, correct?
The Bronze Age computer disc, Laura, was because it's about the same shape and size, and it does the same job as a computer. So, yes, you're absolutely right.
Define computer.
A computer is a device, as you say, like a slide rule or like a pocket calculator, or indeed like piles of stones if you use them properly, which acts to a certain extent as a mathematical mnemonic, which allows you to do big calculations easily.
Oh, like an abacus.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, that's a computer.
Okay. You just have to expand your definition of computer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here's another comment from Nokoyo. He says, if linear A is ever deciphered, we'll find out if he's right.
Maybe, Laura, but I think this raises a really, really interesting point. It doesn't really matter to me what the disc says. I mean, I'd love the disc to say, when it's interpreted, do this, do that, multiply the two together and you'll have a second calendar. I'd love it to say that. But what I'm really going for is what the disc can do rather than what the disc says. But of course it would be nice if it told me those things as well.
The question I had is, if we know so much about the Minoan culture, why don't we know what the symbols that they wrote with mean?
I think that the main reason for that is because we know historically that they spoke a very different kind of language to the Greeks. Once the Mycenaeans took over Minoan Crete in about 1650 BC or thereabouts, the people on the island started to speak Greek. Then we get script like Linear B coming up, which we can understand. But because we don't know the language they were speaking, and because we don't have the equivalent, if you like, of the Rosetta Stone, which shows their language as against another language, we've no way of knowing.
And the demise of the Minoan civilization happened not by war, but by natural
by
disaster.
The eruption of a volcano called, alternatively, either Thera or Santorini. The date is not absolutely known. It was somewhere between 1650 BC and 1450 BC. It was an absolute cataclysm. It was like Mount St. Helens multiplied by 1,000 times, and it really just broke down the infrastructure of the island because it was only 100 kilometers from Crete.
And this is what the event that some people suggest sunk Atlantis. Some people who suggest that Crete was Atlantis or other places, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Crete is often equated with Atlantis. Of course, it doesn't really fit from a geographical point of view if you follow the original Greek descriptions of where Atlantis was. But in every other respect, it fits because it was a super civilization. Admittedly, the island didn't sink, but it was so terrifically destroyed that the island itself, Thera itself, was just not livable anymore afterwards.
So the survivors just sort of evacuated.
Yeah.
Yep.
And after that, the whole island was taken over by another race of people called the Mycenaeans, who came from southern Greece, and the kind of civilization that built the Phaistos Disc ceased to exist effectively.
But the whole culture was, or the various tools and systems of measurement were so widespread that it survived in other places.
I think so, yes, and also very, very much older, and that really leads to the next puzzle.
Which is?
Well, I had worked out that the Phaistos Disc works on the megalithic yard, if you remember, but that was found in Britain and France, and it was known to date back to at least 3,500 BC.
Because that's how old some of those megalithic
That's right. We know
are.
that those monuments were that old, and we know that they were built using that principle, so it must go back at least that far. Well, here was the puzzle, because Minoan Crete did not even exist in 3,500 BC, so they must have been using a system that was much more widespread and at least 1,500 or 2,000 years older.
And this is interesting because this is really precedes the Bronze Age. How far back do you think this goes?
Well, it certainly goes back to the late Stone Age, and it may go back even further. I think a conservative estimate would be around about 4,000 BC, and that's when things get incredibly interesting, because can you imagine that people were using this whole very, very sophisticated system? I mean, I think this is the first stage in our talk where we must say that what they had learnt to do here was not just to measure distance, but time and distance as part of an integrated unit.
Explain that just briefly, and how today we use minutes and seconds to measure distance in a nautical sense.
What we would do now is we use our minutes and seconds as subdivisions of a 360-degree circle, and of course the Earth is roughly a circle, and we have to make very careful comparisons between the geometrical measurements of the Earth and between the passage of time. And so all sorts of conversions have to be made. What seems to have been the case with the Minoans was that they were using a common system. This is a very hard concept to understand, but once it comes across, it's like putting a light bulb on. You don't need to change anything into anything else. A second of time becomes a second of arc. Everything integrates wonderfully. So time, space, and distance become exactly the same thing.
And so what you're really measuring is Earth's rotation minute by minute, second by second.
Yes.
And how much, if you have a standing point, how much distance over it would move. That's the distance that you measure in time.
Yes,
because we're revolving.
Intellectual jump, really.
And therefore they knew the circumference of the Earth, they knew that the Earth was revolving around the Sun, that the Earth revolved around itself, rotated rather, they really understood that. There was, maybe in the Dark Ages they thought the Earth was flat, but not before that.
Yeah. Just as a comparison, Laura, the implications of this system, which is now absolutely beyond doubt, the implications are that they knew the polar circumference of the Earth to within less than 1 kilometre of our present estimation.
Now, what does that imply? How would they have known that? Just simply by hundreds of years of observation?
It's a common extrapolation of the maths. If you know what a megalithic yard measures, by implication, you know exactly how big the Earth is.
Because you know how long it takes to rotate?
Absolutely. You just multiply up and up and up, and eventually you come to a figure which must be the polar circumference of the Earth.
Oh, how interesting. Also, there is from the Stone Age, or prior, there is a set of platonic solids done in stone with little leather straps as the interstices.
Yes, I've come across this before. I think people, earlier on in our conversation, we were talking about trying to make things work harmoniously. And I think this seems to have been inherent in humanity right from the start. They wanted things to be perfect, and they weren't perfect. So the Phaistos Disc works as a system of evening out those little irregularities, if you like.
And we come back. Alan Butler, I'm Laura Lee. Alan Butler, author of the Bronze Age Computer Disc, has just told us the story of how he decoded what's known as the Phaistos Disc. Again, it's a baked clay artifact. It's in what museum in Crete, Alan? If somebody's
Heraclean Museum. Heraclean is in the north of the island, in the centre, and it's very close to the biggest of the ancient palaces, which is called Knossos. Beautiful museum and a lovely city.
And here's a small 5-inch diameter disc, very famous on Crete, that, lucky for you, you went to Crete as opposed to some other island there, right?
Yes, I suddenly thought, if I'd gone to the Canary Islands or something, would I be having this conversation with you now?
Probably not. And we've got conversation for you. So let's start with Michael in Portland, Oregon. Hi, Michael.
Yeah, hello.
Go ahead.
I was wondering about the disc and how it feels, but I had a couple other comments about it.
Well, first of all, what do you mean by how it feels?
Well, when you hold it in your hand...
Not like you can take it out of its display case, right? I mean, you're talking about the original artifact?
Well, I guess he had a replica that somebody made out of it.
Can I interrupt, Laura?
Yes, please, go ahead.
It's absolutely electric. Even a facsimile is electric. But that may be my natural excitement.
Oh, okay. Well, ever since I was a kid, I've been fascinated with spirals, and the more I learn about them, that they're the vortex effects, and many other, or maybe all energy in the universe is spiraling.
Michael, you are absolutely 100% right. The research that I've done since I discovered all this stuff about the Phaistos Disc says to me that the mathematical principles upon which the spiral is based are inherent in all of creation, so you're absolutely right.
Yeah. Well, your approach is interesting and kind of inspiring. It's pretty much left brain as far as the way you're thinking and kind of researching this, because I do a little bit of both, right and left brain, and I have an intuitive feeling about it, and you're having this very mathematical kind of calendar-oriented thing, and I think calendars also go along with empires where masses are determined to control or under control, or religions and things like that. Because when I'm just looking at the sun and the moon and the stars, I don't need calendars and numbers. I mean, the shade, the height of the sun and the sky and all that. So what I'm just saying is, I think the numbers are pretty much the rational part of the mind. And then there's the intuitive, which is how does the spirals work in plants and animals, and now we go into DNA and look at how that spirals and so on. But even branching, which your trees and roots and blood veins and all those kind of things are also spiraling, but we tend not to see it unless you see it in 3 dimensions, which actually then becomes 4 dimensions if you see the change through the spiral. So I was wondering if there's any healing energy that you have heard about or sensed with any of these spiral discs.
I think one of the really, really interesting points about what you're saying, Michael, it ties together very much with what we know about the Minoan civilization. These people were, for example, great worshippers of nature. Nature seems to have been the most important religious principle to them. They must have been aware of some of the mechanisms of nature. They certainly themselves existed at a very intuitive level. For example, examples of fine art are very naturalistic, very wonderful representations on frescoes of all aspects of nature, particularly trees and plants and growing things. So although they arrived at a very rational principle in terms of the numbers used on the disc, I think the intuitional was very strong as well. And you only have to go to Crete to feel the healing presence. It is said of Crete that anything will grow there. And people grow. People grow physically and spiritually in Crete. So I think there's a great deal of truth in what you're saying.
Well, also, whether you are familiar with the Fibonacci principle or not, as we define it, you can see nature unfolding in spirals and operating that way. And you see so many spirals, as you point out, on megalithic artwork. Do you want to comment on that, Alan?
Yeah, we find spirals just about everywhere in the megalithic world. Just to explain for anybody who might not know, Laura, megalithic means big stone. And these were the people who, around about the Bronze Age in many parts of Europe, were shifting huge stones around for all sorts of purposes that we don't quite understand. And on many of these stones, standing stones and stone circles, we find representations of spirals. And up until fairly recently, I think it's safe to say that nobody really had any idea why they were making these. But I think that one of the main expressions was to show exactly what the true passage of the sun was when viewed from the Earth, and that they knew a great deal about the Earth. But I think it had a deeper religious dimension as well. I think the spiral has a great deal to do with the intrinsic power of the deity they represented as the Earth goddess. Anybody who doesn't know, is a beautiful island in the eastern Mediterranean, and off I went on the trip, and I loved the place from the moment I got there. It's like a Garden of Eden. And I was walking around in the local town, which was called Malia, and in a shop window I saw a lot of facsimiles of a little clay disc, which they call the Phaistos Disc, because it was found in a place called Phaistos.
And it's Phaistos.
That's it, yes, and it's in the south of the island. But the disc is to be found everywhere throughout Crete because it's so famous. Although, strangely enough, here in England and across in America, it's not really all that well known. It was found in the ruins of an ancient palace called Phaistos, and it was found at the beginning of this century. I was fascinated immediately. I saw the disc because it's a very unique sort of artifact. There isn't anything else like it in the world. It's about 5.5 inches in diameter, and on each side it's covered with hieroglyphic symbols in certain groupings and within spirals. But no doubt we'll talk about that a bit more as time goes on. But what fascinated me, first of all, was just the thing itself, just the look of the thing, and I've always been a real sucker for anything that's a bit strange or mysterious.
Would you describe the Phaistos Disc for us?
Yes, exactly.
And we have a picture of it and you up on our screen here on our website, but go ahead.
Okay, right. Well, the disc is kind of brick red in colour because it's made absolutely fascinating with anybody who's interested in Cretan history. And when I got up for breakfast the next morning, on the breakfast table, there was a facsimile of the disc, and I'm actually looking at that facsimile now, and it was the guy who owned the hotel who'd got it for me before breakfast. But believe me, if you ever go to Crete, you'll find out that people there are like that. And that's when I realised that the disc had two sides to it. Well, this was the second day into my holiday, and I have to tell you, Laura, it was the end of my holiday, really, in effect, because I just spent the rest of the time I was there trying to find out just as much as I could about the disc and what it might have to say.
Ever the researcher, huh?
Absolutely. I mean, my wife will tell you, that I can't go anywhere without looking at something.
Was she a bit miffed, or was she saying, oh, there he goes again?
Oh, no, she's very happy, fortunately. I'm the luckiest man in the world in that respect. But I think that she knew when we first met that this was the kind of man I am, and I'm not likely to change now.
That's the key to marriage. Never try to change your partner.
Absolutely.
Yep. So what happened then? You pondered over this thing. What kind of avenues did you first take to try to decode this?
Well, I went into the main city of Crete, which is called Heraklion, and I went to the bookshops, and I got as many English translations as I could of books that might mention something about the Phaistos Disc. And in fact, there wasn't really all that much. But I was coming up with the same story time and time again, that all sorts of people had lots of different ideas about what the disc might be, but that nobody had managed to interpret what the hieroglyphics might mean. First of all,
we continue right here with the Laura Lee Show, looking at yet another ancient mystery. We've been researching with every new piece of data that is added to our puzzle, various ancient cultures, their relationship to one another, this shared language, how they were so great at navigation and understanding the world in which they lived and our world's relationship to the solar system at large, their sophisticated astronomy, and this symbolic language that was cross-cultural through times, and we've looked at diffusionism and this trade among cultures, etc., etc. And we've got one more very key piece to add to this puzzle, and that comes from Alan Butler. He's a British researcher, and he will decode what he calls a Bronze Age computer disc. He's here with the story. Hi, Alan. Glad to have you back.
Nice to be with you again.
Alan, by the way, was the one with his research partner decided that the Templars had started the country of Switzerland. We heard about that some weeks ago. But this Bronze Age computer disc, tell us the story of how you happened on this. I understand in your book, Bronze Age Computer Disc, it was on a holiday to Greece. Tell us the story.
Well, it started about 10 years ago, Laura. I decided to take a break. I've been a professional writer for quite some time now, and like everybody, I needed a bit of a break, and I decided to go on a trip to Crete, which it's important to stress that we do know that the disc goes back to a civilization that was living on Crete round about 2000 to 1700 BC, and it was Europe's first super civilization. They were called the Minoans, at least that's the name that we've given to them. We have no idea what these people called themselves, but that's the era that they lived in during the European Bronze Age, roughly contemporary with the time when the New Kingdom was being formed in Egypt, so that gives you a kind of a time reference.
And these, of course, were the very interesting costumes where the women's breasts were just there for all to see.
Oh, they were an incredible culture, Laura. I mean,
these are the ones that flipped over the bowls, these interesting acrobatics with live bowls.
Absolutely, yes. They were really incredible people. We know a great deal more about them than we do about other Bronze Age cultures apart from Egypt, because they left a great many artifacts. For example, they were superb potters, they were great metalsmiths, they were wonderful farmers. Just as an example of their farming acumen, one particular palace, Knossos, which is one of the more famous of the palaces, was running at the time at least 50 to 60,000 sheep. So you can tell that we're not talking about a civilization here which was in any way retarded or held back. In fact, they
had their entrepreneurs,
extremely advanced. They had great entrepreneurial skills. They were mixing with all the other peoples in the region.
Now, here's the real hallmark, Alan, of how sophisticated they were.
Baked clay. It's circular, and on each side it has an incised spiral. And within the spiral, there are groups which are where the spiral has been divided across the worlds of the spiral, and within these groups are groups of hieroglyphics, and they look not dissimilar to Egyptian hieroglyphics. There are pictures of little people and pictures of ears of wheat and pictures of beehives and fish, all sorts of different kinds of pictures, all in different kinds of groupings. And when I first saw the disc, I must say, I thought it was one-sided. I didn't realize it had two sides to it. But it has two sides, and on one side it has 30 groups of hieroglyphics, and on the other side it has 31.
Yeah, by groups you mean that along the spiral they have divisions.
That's right, yes, and within the divisions are groups. Sometimes there's maybe 3 hieroglyphics within a group, sometimes 4, sometimes 5, even as much as 7. But it differs on each occasion, and the hieroglyphics work out from the centre, as it were, forming this pattern of 30 groups on one side and 31 on the other. And to be quite honest, at first I had no idea at all what this might mean, but I managed to obtain a very large picture of the disc, which I took back to the hotel with me, and I sat round the pool like one does on holiday, and I mused about this particular artifact. And I happened to talk to the guy who ran the hotel. Now, everybody in Crete is